So, folks, it is my great pleasure and honour to be introducing Professor Dr. Jerry Root. Jerry Root has been studying C.S. Lewis for 54 years. He's been teaching C.S. Lewis for 44 years to masters and PhD students. Of the books that he's published, of which there are quite a few, 7 of those books are on C.S. Lewis. He has taught at 81 universities in 21 countries. He's the Emeritus Professor of Wheaton College, Illinois, in the United States, and he has spoken at the C.S. Lewis Institute in Washington, Belfast, Chicago, Naples, and South Carolina. Jerry, welcome to our symposium. I've loved that you've been part of my story. I love that you've been part of the C.S. Lewis Institute story, and I'm glad that you're bringing this little paragraph or chapter in our stories here this evening to a close. So please join me in welcoming Professor Jerry Root.
I want to open with a word of prayer. Gracious Heavenly Father, I know that every person in this room has unique challenges in his or her heart. I'm impressed with the way you've wired the different people that I've met. I know some people have deep concerns, academic concerns. They're working to get degrees. They're hoping once they've gotten degrees that they could get academic posts. They've got academic posts and they're having to do lecture prep and they need to publish and they've got a lot of pressure and so on. Other people have other kinds of things, some joys, some sorrows. How can anybody stand in front of a group of people like this and hope to say something that would connect with every unique heart? And then I know, Father, too, I'm a pea brain. I have crumbs to offer. I've been giving due diligence to this, but I also know, Father, my limits. And yet one time your son took something very limited, 5 loaves and 2 fish, and he blessed it and broke it and distributed it and fed a multitude, and they left satisfied. Would your Holy Spirit please do something like that among us today? Would he take the crumbs that are offered and give each person something that he or she could say, that was really meant for me? And that they would have an affirmation in that realization that you loved them, that you gave them what they needed. For that to happen, we need something supernatural to occur, and we look to you that that might be the case. And we ask it in Christ's name, amen. So we're looking at how the writer of Narnia saw the end of the story by looking forward, by looking back. I am sometimes asked, if C.S. Lewis were alive today, what would he think about X? And the questioner usually has some contemporary topic or concern that Lewis never said anything about. And I have no clue how someone can answer such a question, and those who attempt to seem, to my limited observation, to treat Lewis like a ventriloquist treats his dummy. They mediate their own ideas through a Lewis of their imagination as if to lend some authority to the comments. I see something similar with new books that come out about Lewis. Every once in a while, I'll read an author who will say, Lewis believed this. And I think, well, when did he believe that? I've studied Lewis for all these years, and I see he believed some things early on in his life that got significantly modified as he developed and grew. And sometimes he believed something that when they say he believed this, he didn't believe what they say. And it causes me to question this person. And I can usually tell you what books they didn't read if they say Lewis believed this and they didn't get the check or balance. I miss some stuff. I don't get it all right, and I don't remember everything. But I see sometimes a pretense that can happen in some of this writing. On the other hand, I'm impressed when I read in a less pretentious author, new to Lewis studies, who writes, it would appear that Lewis believed this. And there's an honesty, there's a measure to what they say. And I can greatly appreciate that. And I hope that person writes lots more books, and I hope the first person writes lots more too, but I hope they modify themselves a little bit. Lewis warned that such behavior is particularly incautious when discussing religious themes. Note in Reflections on the Psalms when he says, the worst of bad men are religious bad men. The quicker I might be willing to die for my faith, maybe the quicker I'd be willing to kill for my faith. Or painted, thus saith the Lord, across my own opinions. So now you're not arguing with me, you're arguing with God. And you can see where the danger creeps in. If we address matters relative to eschatology, we're treading on theological grounds, as well as talking about future events that are not likely to be accessible without some prophetic insight. University of Chicago rhetorician Richard Reaver, he wrote the book Ideas Have Consequences. He also wrote the sequel, The Ethics of Rhetoric. He observed 4 forms of argumentation and classified them according to their degree of ethical credit. One is the argument from definition. In that situation, you're arguing from something. You set the definition down and you reason inferentially in a coherently developing way. The second form of ethical argumentation is the argument from similitude. That's when you can't get to a definition. The word definition means of the finite, or that which has ends. How do you talk about God? He's infinite. He breaks a category. Even Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven is like. He uses similitude when he argues about the king, or presents things about the kingdom of God. He moves to that argument of similitude. It's a good form of argument when there are limitations that call us to use that. The least ethical form of argument is the argument of consequence. It basically says, you see it in political gatherings. If you vote for my opposition in this election, the whole world will go to hell in a handbasket. How do I know that? I don't. We argue what the consequence is. These things haven't occurred. There's no reality that supports the claim. And consequently, as a result of that, we create fear in people, and it becomes manipulative. He has one other form of argumentation to which Weaver does not assign an ethical category, and it's the argument of authority. You don't know how to argue, so you just quote somebody else, or you produce a book like the quotable C.S. Lewis, something like that. And so that one he doesn't assign something to. But rather than speculating about what Lewis might have said about the eschaton, given the present challenges we see in our world today, and trying to speculate and situate where we might be in the grand scheme of things, my approach will be to look back at what Lewis wrote to see if he might provide guidelines as to how one might think about the eschaton, generally. So I want to draw from what Lewis actually wrote, and I want to gather from some of his big ideas. Lewis wrote about how we understand the nature of history. His essay, Historicism, he says, I give the name historicism to the belief that men can, by use of their natural powers, discover an inner meaning in the historical process. Lewis then makes sure that we understand the difference between historicism and history. I say an inner meaning because I'm not classifying as historicists those who find a meaning in history in any sense whatsoever. Thus, to find causal connection between historical events is, in my terminology, the work of a historian, not of a historicist. So a historicist would begin to say, well, I think that these things in the future clearly mean this, and there's no evidence for that. It looks a little bit like an argument from consequence. He says we have not read history to the end, so how do we make those kinds of judgments about it? It is as if we're living in a play. Lewis therefore asks, how can characters in the play guess the plot? We're on the stage. To play well the scenes which we're on concerns us more than to guess about the scenes that follow it. We have no notion at what stage in the journey we have reached. Are we in Act 1 or Act 5? Are our present diseases those of childhood or senility? We don't know where we are. So we can make judgments about it, but they've got to be tempered judgments. We do not know who are the major and the minor characters. The author knows, but hopefully we could at least assume that we might play our part as best we might, given the condition of the moment. He talks about chronological snobbery. Nobody was running around in the 14th century saying, I live in the Middle Ages. And I think similarly, can we say, oh, we live in the last days? Certainly we're closer to the coming of Christ than we were 10 years ago or 20 years ago, but where are we in the process? We don't know. Furthermore, Lewis's ideas not only about the nature of history, but the nature of truth, particularly set forth in The Abolition of Man, and Lewis's speculation about what happens when truth is denied or suppressed in a society can give us some data that could help us navigate our way through these considerations of the eschaton. In the discussion of truth, I would suggest to you that you could summarize Lewis's argument by saying, truth is not reality. Truth is what I think about reality when I think accurately about it. You've got to have a subjective understanding and an objective reality you're seeking to understand. This is a pen. That's true, because there's something there I can refer to. Now, I can go through all the things like trying to define what it is, but once I settle on the word pen for this, that's a pen. That's true. This is an elephant. That's false. Why? There's no reality that supports the claim. And Lewis writes in his essay on the English syllabus to his students, it was a lecture he gave at Oxford in the 1930s, "We have fulfilled our whole duty to you if we can help you see some given tract of reality." We want you to see this essay clearly. We don't want you to project on it. We want you to draw out of it so that your understanding of the essay can be truly stated, not something that you have compromised. And at the end of his life, actually 1960, he comes out with an experiment criticism. He's still making the same kinds of claims. In coming to understand anything, we must reject the facts as they are for us in favor of the facts as they are. If you begin to make application of what Lewis is saying about the nature of truth, you could say this: we can have a sure word about something. This is a pen. We don't get a last word about anything. I could talk about it, about its length, about its width. I could talk about its molecular structure. If Aristotle was here, he would say we could talk about its formal cause, the pattern after which it was made, its material cause, the efficient cause, its final cause, how it writes on paper, how it writes on cardboard, how it writes on paper smeared with butter not very well, We can also see that though you can have a sure word, that means you can say with confidence this is a pen. Authoritatively, it's a pen. But you have to say it also with the humility of an open hand, knowing that any truth you know, you can still plumb more deeply. You could apply more widely, even to questions you haven't even begun to ask yet. And you could understand a truth in some sort of coherent relation with other truths that you've studied. Well, where Lewis sets this forth most clearly, and where I think it will help us when we think about what we might do, given the eschaton, is in his Abolition of Man. The background of the book, you guys have all, is there anybody who hasn't read The Abolition of Man? I'm speaking to a very educated group here. Okay, well, The Abolition of Man, he had gotten a book to review. He calls it the Green Book. It was written for sixth form. That would be, if you're an American, 11th and 12th graders, an English text, supposedly. And he's given this book to review, and he says, we don't pay enough attention to the philosophies that are sometimes embedded in various textbooks. And these authors, he names them Gaius and Titius. He doesn't want to embarrass them. He doesn't give us the name of the book. The book's actually The Control of Language, and it's by Alec King and Martin Catley. I'll embarrass them because they're gone and so on. But if you want to read the book, it's at Wheaton College. We have it in the Wade Center. You can see his marginalia and so on. But the authors of the Green Book said that Samuel Taylor Coleridge was with William Wordsworth, and they were at a waterfall. It took me 15 years to find what waterfall it was. And it's Dorothy Wordsworth's Grassmere Journals, 1803. Malcolm would know that. Did anybody else know that before I said it? But see, I should have asked Malcolm, but I've only known him for about 15, 20 years. And if I would have known him back then, but I asked all kinds of people. It was the Coralline waterfall on the River Clyde. I had to go see it. I did. It's not a long cascading waterfall like Yellowstone Falls. It kind of stair steps down, and it's glorious and it's beautiful. And Coleridge is there, and he says that there were two tourists, and one of them said the waterfall was pretty. The other one said it was sublime. And Gaius and Titius said, Coleridge had no right to make that judgment about the waterfall because these two tourists were only saying something about their feelings of the waterfall. And in that moment, the Gaius and Titius divorce the assessment from the object, the subjective understanding from the objective reality. And in doing that, they do disaster to the approach to truth. And the interesting is, for me, Coleridge agreed with the one who said it was sublime, disagreed with the one who said it was pretty. Neither of them were saying something negative about the waterfall. It wasn't A versus non-A. They're both saying something positive, but one had a more robust description, and consequently, Coleridge endorsed that description. The irony is that when Gaius and Titius say that Coleridge had no right to make the judgment, they were making a judgment about Coleridge, and their judgment was divorced from the reality. And the tragedy is, what's the basis of their judgment? It was utterly self-referential. It was not rooted in the reality. And consequently, then, Lewis is deeply concerned about these things, as he should be. He goes on and he defines this objective reality. He gives it, interestingly enough, an Eastern term. He calls it the Tao. You could say Tao if you prefer. He calls it the Tao and defines it as the doctrine of objective value, the belief that certain things are really true and others really false to the kind of thing we are and the kind of thing the universe is. He's making the assertion of an objective approach to truth. Why does he use the word Tao? I have a theory that he used it because he wanted to show this was not just a Western concept. This is a universal concept. And he validates that assumption by his appendix, where in the appendix he has example after example after example from the East, from the West, from time immemorial, and so on, to support this concept of objectivity. Later in the book, he talks about if Gaius and Titius are making a judgment, what's their basis for judgment? And he gives 3 different examples, all rather self-referential, and he begins to dismantle each one. Then what does he say in the last chapter of that book, or chapter 3? He says, if we turn our back on objective reality, it will eventually lead to the unraveling of a society, and it will lead to the abolition of man. Because that which allows us to make the judgment that humans have dignity and value and should be treated accordingly so we could treat them justly and so on. So anyway, what ends up happening, I think, is we lose language in the process when we become self-referential. The very nature of language demands that we have something of this kind of objectivity. You've got the word symbol, comes from 2 Greek words, soon, which means together or with, and bole, to cast. You cast together 2 things. I take a word, pen. I don't have to call it a pen. I could have called it a Gesortenblatt. The word is utterly arbitrary at first, but once I use the word to describe this, I can't be arbitrary if I want language to occur. Now we have to settle on this word. And consequently then too, it allows for communication to occur. It allows for community to develop. It allows for culture to develop. The word has to be tethered to the object. And what Lewis writes about in particularly that hideous strength, where he puts in imaginative depiction what his fears are in the abolition of man, we see a culture that begins to unravel. Talk more about that in a minute. When language no longer expresses the realities of the word before us, civilization begins to unravel, and we see it now. Oh, you could be whatever pronoun you want. Oh, you could be whatever gender you want. These things are utterly arbitrary, and consequently language breaks down, and with language breaks down culture. So how does Lewis depict these things in his fiction? Let's look at it. Lewis says in The Abolition of Man, any society accepts subjectivism of the Green Book, sets up a course for collapse. What might it look like? He depicts it, Jadis, Queen of Charn. She's the queen of this world, and she is so evil. She becomes a white witch, of course, of Narnia. She's so evil that her whole world has mounted up in civil war against her. She has learned by magical arts, if such a thing like this happens, that she could say the deplorable word that will destroy everybody else but leave her by herself. Very, very self-referential, so on. Very tyrannical. Uncle Andrew in that book also is a subjectivist, self-referential. He blows up guinea pigs and harms animals and puts the lives of others at risk in his own self-exaltation. By the way, did you notice ever that all of Lewis's evil characters are all cruel to animals? And Lewis sees you're cruel to animals, you don't have any transcendent value that would guard you on these things, and it's easy then to slide into cruelty to other things as well. Lewis was you guys, I'm sure you've read his book on vivisection and so on, and also he writes in a letter to one of the children, in letters to children, my neighbors trap the mice they find in their house. I feed the ones I find in my house. I mean, he was just a tender-hearted guy. But anyway, Jadis, Queen of Charn, is an example. She speaks a deplorable word, destroys everybody in her world but herself. And in that moment, she becomes anti-Aslan. And in a sense, depicts for us Antichrist. Well, that could be helpful if we think by virtue of biblical revelation, there might be something really bad with some really bad tyrant. But what does that tyrant look like? It looks like any tyrant you would find. Looks like Jadis, Queen of Charn, and so on and so on. You've got Weston in Out of the Silent Planet, and Perelandra. We've heard much about him throughout the day. He denies the central reality of the universe, thus divorcing himself from the possibility of knowing truth and its objective standards. He begins as a virtual Antichrist, moves towards tyranny and conquest, not merely of earth, but even of the universe. He becomes the unman, in complete denial of all that gives validity to objective value. He is an example, a case in point of the abolition of man. You've got the NICE, the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments, in that hideous strength. And here again, Lewis depicts the loss of language, the loss of meaningful communication, the cultivation of ambiguity, the loss of community, contrasting the NICE with the manor at St. Anne's, which is very inclusive. If you read the membership versus the inner ring, NICE is the inner ring, membership is inclusive. They have males, females, they have wealthy, they have poor, they have educated, uneducated. They even have McPhee, who I think is a little bit modeled after Kirkpatrick, William T. Kirkpatrick, the great knock. And they have animals. They have Mr. Bultitude, they have the jackdaw. You want to read some creative writing, read what Lewis writes about the mind of Mr. Bultitude in that hideous strength. It's fabulous stuff. Anyway, at St. Anne's, this inclusive group, you have that which is affirming of others. But at the NICE, you have that is diminishing. It's the abolition of man. It's the abolition of culture. In the Great Divorce, it's the same thing. You have Lewis finding himself on the bus from hell. In hell, what is it? It's further down and further out. Remember when he's on the bus and they have jumbles and there's fights break out and somebody else is sitting next to him on the bus? And he learns from one of them that there were some guys down in hell that went to see Napoleon, and he's 2 million miles out. So here it is, and here's our French scholar here. Only a Brit would see the worst person in hell, a Frenchman 2 million miles out, you know. But nevertheless, they said, what was he doing? What was he saying? And he says, oh, it was Salt's fault. It was Nay's fault. It was Josephine's fault. And he's blaming everybody else for what's going on. Keep that in mind, because what happens at the end of the Great Divorce? We saw an image on one of the screens. Who was it that had the image of Frank and Sarah Smith of Golders Green? I don't remember who it was. But anyway, Sarah Smith of Golders Green. Lewis finds himself in hell. You know how it goes. George MacDonald is his Virgil leading him through hell. They have these different encounters. And he sees this glorious woman. And he says, who was that? She must have been a great figure. Oh, no. That was Sarah Smith of Golders Green. You would have never heard of her. But every person that crossed her path, she breathed dignity into their life. She knew the weight of glory. There were no ordinary people in her life. She's a model of that. And she walks up to what Lewis describes as big tragedy enactor. And he realizes there's a dwarf next to him, but he's looking at the tragedy enactor. And finally, Sarah Smith goes and talks to the dwarf. And he realizes that the dwarf, Frank, is the one she's concerned about. It's the dwarf. The tragedy enactor is just an alter ego, a pretense. And he denies reality, and in denying reality, he shrinks and gets smaller and smaller and smaller till he can't even have substance enough to hold the cord that's keeping him tethered to the tragedy enactor. Shortly after that, George MacDonald's character says to Lewis, I want you to look in the ground here. You see that grain of sand? Hell is no bigger than that grain of sand. And what we learned at the beginning was Napoleon was 2 million miles out in that grain of sand. Everybody is shrinking and shrinking. They're not being annihilated, but they're being diminished. There's an abolition-like characteristic. In the screw tape, and what does he say in The Great Divorce? To two different characters, he makes a comment, something like this. Could you only for a moment fix your mind on something, not yourself? Could you not for a moment break out of the subjectivism that would allow you to see objective reality the way that is? This is the same Lewis who, again, to his students said, our whole duty to you is to help you see some given track of reality. He's doing it for his readers of his fiction. In the Screw Tape Letters, we see something similar. It's interesting to me, the humility in Lewis. If you read the preface to the second edition, he said, some have paid me the undeserved compliment of supposing that my letters are the ripe fruit of many years' study of moral and ascetic theology. They forget there's an equally reliable, though far less creditable way to know how ungodliness works. My heart, I need no others, showeth me the way of the wicked. He wants to break out of that subjectivism. He wants to see the world for sure. What can we know with certainty, given the expectation that history is moving towards an end, and we want to understand our place in time truly, objectively, as well too as the fact that our lives are also destined to an end? I would suggest to you that there are 4 essays where Lewis spells this out. To prepare for this time, I reread all of Lewis's essays, just to gather from them some kernels that we could put together. We'll never get to the bottom of all he wrote about it, but let's just look at a few features. I'm sure there's stuff I've left out, but let's look at it. First, it was a sermon called De Futilitate. You'll find it in Christian Reflections. It was a sermon he preached at Magdalen College, Oxford, right when the war broke out. If you've been to Oxford, you'll see etched in the walls the names of people of the different colleges who died in the war. And they all saw him. The war breaks out. World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. All of these 19-year-old kids, 20-year-old kids, they all remembered 2 decades before, and they saw their uncles without arms or no eyes or big scars on their faces. They all knew somebody like this. And now this war broke out that they know is going to be more mechanized than anything World War I was. It would have the benefits of the Spanish Revolution and Hitler's war machine that he had tested out. And they all see, when they walk to college, the etchings on the wall, and they are looking at their future. Wow. Why should we even be in college? It's all futile. And they asked Lewis if he'd speak a sermon. It was, I think, the second week the school started that year. And he preached this message called De Futilitate, of futility. And he said, all judgments imply a standard. How can you say it's futile? What's the standard by which you make that judgment? And if you don't have a standard, then the judgment doesn't really mean that which should cause you despair. There may be more here for you to discover. Our sense that the universe is futile, Lewis writes, and our sense of duty to make those parts of it we can less futile, both really imply a belief that it is not in fact futile at all. A belief that values are rooted in reality, outside ourselves, that the reason in which the universe is saturated is also moral. Don't make the judgment, everything is futile. You have a reason for being here. The call to an objective standard and the adjustment of our lives and to that standard is to embrace the dignity of human flourishing. Well, the university got wind that Lewis had given this talk at Magdalen. They said, would you give a talk to the entire university? So about 2 months later at St. Mary's, the big university church on the high street, he gives a lecture called On Learning in Wartime. That's not what it was originally called, but that's what it came to be called. And during that particular lecture, he says, war does not increase death. He could have said, aging doesn't increase death. Disease doesn't increase death. Accidents doesn't increase death. COVID didn't increase death. Reason why? Because death is total in every generation. The consequences of things like the eschaton, the consequences of war, the consequences of danger. Do you guys remember 9/11? 9/11? So when that day happened, it moved me deeply. That guy Todd Beamer, who was on Flight 93, who said, let's roll when they took it back, he was a student of mine. He used to come to my house for Bible study. What was he doing that day? He got up to go to work, to do a little business, and he was going to fly back the next day to be with his wife, Lisa, who also used to be a student of mine. And he never laid his head back down on that pillow again. And I remember saying to myself, wow, how can we be safe? When did we ever think we should be safe? I said to myself, well, what's this going to come to mean? When did we think that we had the privileged opportunity to make sense out of everybody and see what it means? Because we live in a world where we believe there's sense to be made, that we believe there's a transcendent, objective basis for making sense out of these things. And basically, that's what Lewis said. If you want to wait till conditions are right before you do anything, you'll never do anything. I don't believe any of us are very life-skilled. I don't think anybody's ever ready to get married. If you waited till you were, you'd miss out on all those joys. I don't think anybody's ever ready to have children. If you waited till you were, this whole human race would end this generation. I think all of us function at a level of awkwardness. You're a toddler learning to walk, you fall down and get bruised. You take the training wheels off of the two-wheel bike when you're 5 and you fall down and get abrasions. You pick up a skateboard, you learn how to ollie or take on a half pipe. You sprain an ankle or break a wrist. I don't know how it is in your countries, but in our country, when you're in elementary school or primary school, you have a one-room classroom experience. You go to middle school and you have to navigate 6 classrooms in one day with a locker that never seems to work. And you're on the threshold of adolescence, the most purgatorial period of human development. And remember how awkward you were? If you got married, remember how awkward you were right at the beginning? How awkward you were the next month, and the month after that, and the month after that, the year after that? Every new experience reveals to us levels of awkwardness. And consequently, if you're not awkward someplace in your life, you're just not growing. Consequently, it seems to me that these kinds of endpoints should reveal to us that there's something in us that needs to develop. And that can develop in any condition, in any circumstance, and so on. So in Learning in Wartime, he's pointing that out. The only people who achieve much are those who want knowledge so badly that they seek it while the conditions are still unfavorable. Favorable conditions, Lewis writes, never come. He then writes an essay on living in an atomic age. And basically he resurfaces the same arguments, but puts it in a different context. The atomic age creates no new circumstances. Lewis asks, how are we to live in an atomic age? This becomes really important. I am tempted to reply, why, as you would have lived in the 16th century when the plague visited London almost every year, or as you would have lived in a Viking age when raiders from Scandinavia might land and cut your throat any night. Or indeed, as you are already living in an age of cancer, an age of syphilis, an age of paralysis, an age of air raids, an age of railway accidents, an age of motor accidents. We must draw the conclusion that we are not derived from the natural world. We're strangers here. We come from somewhere else. Nature is not the only thing that exists. There is another world, and that is where we come from, and that explains why we do not feel at home here. But it also means that we're not getting our prescriptions from the natural world. We're getting them from something transcendent, something revealed, something objective. All history has been lived in times where the end of civilization has stood at what appeared at the time to be the end of history as we know it. We have lived on a precipice. And then he writes about it in The World's Last Night, the fourth of these essays. Lewis, being a Christian, writes this essay to call his readers to hope. He looks to something that transcending the vicissitudes of time and looks to eternity. He writes, now what death is to each man, the second coming is to the whole human race. Precisely because we cannot predict the moment, we must be ready at all moments. We must never speak to simple, excitable people about the day without emphasizing again and again the utter impossibility of prediction. We must try to show them that the impossibility is an essential part of the doctrine. If you do not believe in our Lord's words, why do you believe in his return at all? And if you do believe them, you must put away from you utterly and forever any hope of dating that return. His teaching consists, Lewis's teaching consists, or he says Jesus' teaching consists of three propositions. One, that he will certainly return. Two, that we cannot possibly find out when. Three, that therefore we must always be ready for him. That means we must always be cultivating character, faithfulness, and these sorts of things. And so I kind of want to move in that direction by way of application. What time are we supposed to end, Stuart? Huh? 6:30? So I got about 20 minutes? No? I can't read it. 15, 20, 20 minutes?
15.
Huh?
15, 17.
Okay. So what I want to do then is I want to cultivate this idea then of what Lewis does say about the eschaton is the kind of life he thinks we're called to in any kind of unpredictable set of circumstances. And basically, he says two things. We should be living lives of obedient faith. That's number one. Number two, we should be living lives of virtue and cultivating virtue in the world where we find ourselves. Let me talk about obedient faith. And I'll just give you some examples of what obedience looks like. In Lewis's anthology of George MacDonald, George MacDonald says, obedience is the opener of eyes. In this awkward life that we live, there's so many things I just don't understand. And I see in the Bible that it tells me I should do certain things. And if I try to interpret as best I can in community with others so that there could be checks and balances when I go off the rails or something like that, I discover what God is calling me to. And if I obey, it's in the act of obedience that I begin to understand why God says do this. If I'm disobeying, none of it will make sense to me. Obedience, Lewis quoting MacDonald there, is the opener of eyes. If I disobey any kind of thing, Aristotle talks about this issue of akrasia or akrasia. Akrasia is the Greek word for command. You put the alpha negation on it, you lose command. In other words, I lose command when I do something wrong and start to make excuses for it. Rationalize my behavior. Lewis put it this way in a preface to Paradise Lost. Continued disobedience to conscience makes conscience blind. Paul put it this way. We suppress truth in our unrighteousness. But obedience is the opener of eyes. Number two, Lewis said obedience is, this is a paraphrase, but he says obedience is a splint God places on a broken life that it might mend. I obey and I begin to build up what was broken in me in that act of obedience, always obeying on the foundation of God's grace, his love and forgiveness and so on. G.K. Chesterton said, obedience is it's like a fence. It protects us from the things outside that mean harm. And if I put my nose up against that fence and pine over what I can't get, I need to turn my back to that same fence and see that it also defines a playground in which I can enjoy life. And God's calling me to that enjoyment of life and that purposeful living in the days as we wait for the eschaton. And if I might add my own insight to these other commentators, I would say to us, obedience accesses for us the benefits of omniscience. I am a pea-brain. I don't know very much. But every time I obey, I step into the realm of benefiting from the omniscient God who said, here's what I want you to do. Here's what I want you to experience. Here's how I want you to live. Here's the eschaton. Here's whatever difficulty might be emblematic of that eschaton, some war, some disease, something like this. But if I obey, I'm living in the benefits of omniscience. So anyway, given these realities, we're called to go on living in faithful obedience before God and before others. Next, we're called to virtue. In The Abolition of Man, Lewis writes this: for the wise men of old, the cardinal problem had been how to conform the soul to reality. So I'm not only conforming my thoughts to reality so I'll think truly, I'm conforming my life to reality so I will live authentically and truly as well. So for the wise men of old, the cardinal problem had been how to conform the soul to reality, and the solution had been knowledge, self-discipline, and virtue. In The Abolition of Man, Lewis wrote that. He's got this throwaway line in The Allegory of Love. It's a great book. But there's a line on page 60 where he just says, innocence is not goodness. He's not saying innocence is not good. It's good in that it's unspoiled. But it's not goodness in that it's proven character. Innocence is not goodness. Even divine nature cannot make virtue a gift. Virtue is something that has to develop in us and be cultivated in us. And we begin to cultivate virtue by seeing reality as best we might, with clarity. And the process is not without its challenges because we're fallen and broken people. Lewis's use of mirrors and moments of disequilibrium are profound in his works. Remember the Great Divorce? He's on the bus again. He's going up with these despicable people, and he's describing them every time a fight breaks out. He's sitting next to somebody else after the jumble. And as he describes, he doesn't tell you they're despicable. He just shows you the conversation, and you say, wow, that's a despicable person. And then right when he gets to the light of heaven, and the light of heaven comes shining through the windows of the bus, he looks down the aisle of the bus, and what does he see? The mirror. And he sees his own visage. I am one of these people. It's a satire, but Lewis writes satire manquée. It's not a satire. Most satirists look down at the foibles of people, and you're always at risk of becoming proud with that kind of satire. Lewis takes his satire and always turns it back on himself. He's one of these people. That's helpful for us to see. And consequently, you see these mirrors in Dahmer. Dahmer thinks he's really brave, and he comes into this manor house, and he sees this room full of mirrors, and he thinks he's being attacked, and all of a sudden this brave Dahmer, he moves into cowardice at that moment. You've got Eustace Clarence Scrubb. When does he discover he's a dragon? Not on board the Don Treader when he's just been a brat, but he discovers it when he is at the dragon's hoard, and he looks in the water, and he sees the reality, and he is so sad. He's so ready to have transformation. Aslan changes him, but somebody said earlier today, he wasn't changed immediately. There was a process now, and that's the process we find ourselves in thoughts about the eschaton. So anyway, Lewis has this, or Rule looks in this pond, and she sees she's everything she hates. I am Unget. Later, she looks in the pond, and she sees I am Psyche. She sees what she's being made into. And it's interesting, isn't it? How does it end, right? She's complained against the gods. She dies. The priest has her journal sent to Greece with a note. And before she dies, she writes, I wrote in my first book, no answer. I see now that you are yourself the answer. Before your face, all questions die away. She dies. And we think, here's this woman who had this complaint against the gods. We see her struggle. We see some tyranny when she denies objective reality. She's cruel to her sister Redival. She is not willing to release the fox to go back to Greece. She takes all of the time of Bardia from his own wife and family. She sucks the energy out of people, so self-referential. And she's describing this in the book, and we're reading it, and we're making these judgments. She's not making the judgments. And then even her sister Psyche says, I think I've seen some forms of hate that I like better than your form of love. And you just are shocked by this. But the priest, after she dies, after she has really her moment of conversion at the very end of that book, he writes a letter and he says, whoever finds these things, they were written by Orul, Queen of Glome, the most just, the greatest, the kindest, and all of these things. And we see the transformation comes because she was honest with herself and wrote honestly, and we are included and able to see her honesty. You know how they say, the secrets you can't talk about, they control you. You got to have friends in your life. And she treats us as readers like a father confessor. And we don't realize that the transformation is really going on in her life, but we see modeled that kind of honesty as something that we're called into, even by virtue of that book. She was better than she gave herself credit for. Well, anyway, there's more we could say, but I want to talk about virtue for a second then. This realization that we're people in need, and anything that brings us to that, any thoughts of the eschaton that brings us to the place where we're willing to say, okay, I want to live my life in faithful obedience. I want to live my life cultivating virtue in the context where there are no ordinary people, where I bear the weight of glory. So what is virtue? Virtue is an integrated whole made up of 4 characteristics. Lewis writes about them in Mere Christianity. He writes about them in The Discarded Image. He gives models of them throughout his literature. Virtue is made up of 4 characteristics: courage, temperance, justice, and wisdom. Courage, temperance, justice, and wisdom. And their habits. One act of temperance, pushing away one time that second piece of pie, doesn't make you a temperate person. It has to be a habit of temperance, a habit of courage, so on. So let me define them then. And we'll close with these definitions. Courage is the habitual ability to suffer pain and hardship. It's endurance, fortitude, and staying power. Courage is a habitual ability to suffer pain and hardship. It's endurance, it's fortitude, it's staying power. Courage is the ability to say yes to right action, even in the teeth of pain. Temperance, another feature of virtue, and again, it's an integrated whole. Temperance is the habitual ability to resist the enticement of the immediate pleasure in order to gain the greater, though more remote good. Temperance is the habitual ability to resist the enticement of immediate pleasure in order to gain the greater, though more remote good. His courage is the ability to say yes to right action, even in the teeth of pain. Temperance is the ability to say no to wrong action, even in the jaws of pleasure. Justice. Justice is the one area of virtue that says my moral development is linked to my responsibility to others. Justice is the area of virtue that invites me into the weight of glory. Edmund, he betrays his siblings, but when he's redeemed, he's renamed what? Edmund the Just, because he ends up becoming one who could go and rescue, be father confessor to Eustace. Eustace ends up going and being father confessor to Aurelian. And Lewis has this sense that once our lives have been touched by grace, we would be ambassadors of grace. So justice is the habit of being law-abiding and concerned for the general welfare of one's society. Justice is a habit of being law-abiding and concerned for the general welfare of one's society. My moral development is linked to my responsibility to others. It renders to others their due. It is fair. And then you've got wisdom. Wisdom is the habit of being careful about decisions one makes. It seeks counsel and advice. Wisdom begins by realizing we're all pea-brains, really. We don't know very much. And we want to stay in community with others where we can benefit from what they see. Not only their shortcomings in our life, but maybe their wisdom, their perspective on something that we might have missed out on. There's so much to learn from others. And wisdom, I think, is the characteristic of the scaffold. If you go to London sometimes, go to Hampton Court, King Henry VIII's home, and there's a huge hedge maze there. When we used to live in England, we'd take our kids to labyrinths. They thought they were amazing. And then when we would go to the labyrinths, we would sit outside, you pay the proprietor a little money, and the kids would go in there. Claudia and I would sit there with a cup of coffee. They couldn't get out. That was the only way out. So it was like the hedge became a babysitter. But if you got lost, you cried out to the proprietor, and he would climb up the scaffolding that was right there, and he could see from his elevated perspective where you were, and he could guide you out. Wisdom is the perspective of the scaffold. It recognizes in this maze of life, we need perspective. And so there you go. I think we get it from Scripture largely. I think we can get it from one another and whatnot. So there you go. The eschaton, Lewis is not going to make strong judgments about it. He says it doesn't bring on anything new. We've been living under these kinds of conditions all of our life. The world has operated on this. We're not going to wait till things are perfect before we do anything. But in this process, we can develop and cultivate faithful obedience, and we can cultivate virtue, and we can grow in our responsibilities to one another. That's it.